It's, what is it, Sunday, November 20th? We're in Caleb Yono's show, Portal, and we're so happy to have you.
Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for showing up. I'm Caleb Yono, this is Cassandra Jackson. Definitely couldn't have done this project without her, so definitely like a force of love and collaboration between the both of us. Generally it's interesting to us because we were involved in the performance in such an extent that we almost had blinders on, and I occasionally would see people, and I think Cassandra definitely had blinders on a lot of the time. She was kind of blind the whole time. Yeah. So for us to get a sense of what happened, it's been interesting to see stills and like what we do have, and some of the video clips. So that was pretty awesome of people to do that for us. So thank you, Dana. Awesome pictures, and thank you, Chris. Anyone else? We kind of would like maybe, I don't know, I think sort of we definitely have some things to say about how this started for us and where we were going, but also with like maybe a sense of some people's impressions that were at the performance and things that they took away from it would be really helpful to us. And so maybe people could maybe start off by saying a few things that they thought were interesting about the show. And spotlight, boom.
I was suggesting, because I was in there at the performance and I were the only one who missed it, or there's other people that knew that. So maybe I started slide. Huh?
We didn't see.
Yes.
Okay, well then maybe I can sort of, or we both can describe sort of what happened in the space, not just from looking at the pictures, but the one element that's not here is sort of the sound element and the sort of live active parts of our costume. There's sort of these dormant dead pieces of what we did, but there was a lot of sort of thinking and put into creating an active space that not only we participated in, but we were hoping the audience would, and at some points they did. So we had a sound piece that I worked with Benjamin Carnion, who's not here, obviously, and he and I started sort of working together, and me sort of observing over a period of time how he creates electronic music and sort of the devices that are out there in this realm of, I guess, independent electronic music and all these that are the heirs to last century and all these kind of music concrete and all these guys researching how to manipulate electronic signals. So we worked on this program that would constantly re-record the room. So that was our first just desire. We wanted to create that. We wanted to create a room that something could be said, it would feed into a sort of an interface of digital sound processing and analog sound processing, and feed back into the room and then be picked back up again and constantly record. Immediately we came in contact with feedback because two sounds trying to occupy the same space. So we sort of intuitively, it's this process of back and forth, sort of like sculpting it in my sort of like blind, I don't know too much about this interface that he's working with and his knowledge of it, and it was a really interesting collaboration, and we just started solving things one by one so we could have a more sort of diverse range of ways to manipulate the sounds that were happening. On top of that, we sort of, as performers, Cassandra and myself and Lindsay all sort of started conceptualizing devices that we could use to create different sorts of textures.
So like
and noise.
filter the voice and be able to change the voice to kind of exploit the fact that there is a transformation that's happening and that the voice is changing and it's not, it's not stagnant, it's like forever evolving. And there were devices in the room that were sort of doing that too, and then there was devices that were kind of like strapped to us or instruments that we could pick up, and it was, we were all sort of like blind and just being thrown into this like sacred place of objects that are completely loaded, and at times we're like, exchanging roles on either being the teacher or the student or reversing those roles and seeing what happens with that. And Lindsay was kind of thrown in there as the antagonist to sort of like, she was really the blind one that just didn't know, she didn't need to know anything. That was like what was perfect about her because she's very good with improv. So we knew we could just throw her in and she would just be herself, you know, and that was really great.
Yeah, she sort of kind of just, we all sort of worked together, just a note on Lindsay, and sort of these free improvs of sort of noise making together, generating with our bodies and movement together. So that was one aspect that started to feed into the piece as well. In terms of the space outside of what was on our, that we could make noises with, we sort of took on a sort of magical realm. We were believing in sort of symbols that have existed throughout sort of human cultures that are imbued with a power. So the salt and hair, and so present at this sort of space was all this hair of women who get their hair cut at the salon in Logan Square. So it was sort of this sort of chatter present of like clipping shears and, you know, this. I really appreciated and wanted that to happen as sort of a way. I don't know. It's sort of like brainwashing or something. Like remote brainwashing. There are some kind of more like, that's sort of just description of what happened. It did. I think that regardless, I think if you tune into the persona or the inner kind of like less conscious self of any of the stuff, well, so many subjects, and this is a great sort of grandiose statement that I'm making, but whatever, of individuals living in sort of a Western society, you're going to encounter them stuck in this sort of Jungian trickster cycle, which is the first cycle of the heroic cycle, right? That we are sort of heirs to culturally, and it exists in a lot of our sort of storytelling. The way we sort of, so much is based on it. The way we tell stories and the way we interact with each other is based on this struggle for this sort of like heroic existence. But we're all stuck in the first level, which is this sort of like immature ranting and raving. I want more, like changing of the mind, mood swings, a fragmentation, and that can also, that sort of topic can lead to another conversation about subjectivity and capitalism that for me was definitely present in the work, probably more strongly than the other participants in a lot of ways. I think that we all sort of took this belief that we had in this project and geared it towards our own sort of inputs that we've had in our lives running and continuing to run through us. So that's a sort of another, but after maybe we hear some thoughts about the performance from y'all, will be a little bit more expressive about those points.
Totally don't know where to begin. I mean, it was so many.
It's hard. That's the thing. Preparing for this, I've been like, how do I talk about certain things? How, in what way do I do them? And I just sort of, because there is a bit of there's something that wants to silence sort of some of the reactions to, I think, things that happen in a space that's about sort of silly things, but powerful things.
Well, it was like we wanted to create a context for this fantasy world that we live in when we get together.
Yeah.
I mean, when we get together, we lose ourselves in another reality that feels more real than the one we live in today, you know? So it's like, how do we bridge those two worlds? Like, what context does this exist so that it can reach out to people outside us?
And not just be fantasy.
Because language doesn't really work. The more you talk about these ideas, the more disbelief you have like fed back to you, and that discourages the whole point of like living in that world. So I think giving it something visual is like what we needed in order to express what it meant.
And Cassie, yeah, you were also saying like the art context, right? Like the art context makes it sort of like, it's okay.
It gives it a place to exist, and we we accept the fact that it may not be understood the way that we do. So if you were confused, then I think that's completely normal.
And like about like expectation and like how people interpret it, like the whole time me making it, I was going through my own neuroses, like that I go through with everything, and just like this sort of repetitive desire to like control things in a certain way. But on another level, I was really trying to imbue this with another sort of force that's sort of the antithesis of that sort of energy, something more like thonic, something more like dirty, something more raw that isn't so like conservative and concerned with a certain level of like stature that you have to maintain consciously in order to like move forward in our society. I kind of wanted to fall below that line sometimes, but it got scary. And I think that the point of the performance, it just happened. Like all of that was being held back sort of just exploded for me and exploded for Cassie in different ways. And we sort of attached that sort of inner compulsion to different sort of visual elements or different sorts of like archetypes for sure that we were conscious of, but we didn't realize how powerful that they would become in our sort of like transformation and progress. We we had been preparing for this for quite a long time, but before the performance we both lived in this for like 9 days before.
Yeah.
And we went crazy.
And that was
really
the whole
went
idea.
crazy.
We talked about going crazy before we even went crazy. And
Yeah.
we talked about how we need some kind of ground to share in order to like bring each other back if we get too deep.
Yeah, and I'm always envious of Cassandra's ability to believe so strongly in some of these things, because it's like, so here's sort of like a little spiel, and it'll change my tone in the way that I speak because I'm reading, but whatever. So for me, it's centered so much around the idea of belief and the potential active site of what belief is, and to believe in a more unexplainable interconnectedness between moments, bodies, emotions, thoughts, actions, earth, subjects, etc. It's sort of my understanding through observing human behavior and the things that we make and the things that we latch onto, that the Enlightenment has sublimated a certain sense of magic about the world, but it's sublimated into capitalism. It can't exist without this sort of like desire for objects that have, or experiences that have certain auras or relationships to our subject making. The Enlightenment has sublimated the magic necessary for capitalism into a strange disbelief and surrender. The major commodities of capitalism is the subject, so that magic sort of like is the sort of spark of life that's fueling all of us to like move forward in life through this sort of desire for these objects that we think are just building our subjects. And that's like a really powerful space to act from, because if you're taking on the role of sort of like a shaman, right? And you're looking for a magical space to start working from. Where is that in contemporary society? That is in that lull, that siren-like song of an object calling you, right? There's some way to like invert that power and make it so it's not such a sleepy slumber power, but it's a more active power. So in the forming of the self, that space of belief, if you really start to believe in these things that lay outside of this idea that like there is no magic, but magic sort of fuels, and I use magic in a way like, I don't know, in quotes, I don't know, whatever. I mean, it's funny that enlightenment, that the effects of the Enlightenment are so powerful on us, and you see it when you start to have conversations with people about more esoteric matters, especially if you really believe in them, and not in sort of like this handed down kind of understanding of it with like paisley frocks and like, red candles and the Season of the Witch leftover from the 60s. That's great, but like in a real way, right? Like in a real way, people look at you like you're nuts. And why is that? We're so conservative. Like, by what? And I've said this, like I thought about it, but by what means and to what ends is anyone sort of moving forward? Like, I'm not going to have children. So, you know what I mean? Like, I might have a relationship that lasts for more than 5 years. So, by what means? So, like, what do I have? What's fueling me forward? I don't know, but I'd rather start designing that a little bit more, or being more like, I might want to participate in it a little bit more, and not just in an artistic sense. And I think belief is powerful. We all believe in this system and structure around us, even though it's like crippling us and the rest of the world. And I don't know.
No, I think that's exactly the way you and I were talking about belief the other day. I think it's important to emphasize that we are actually very much believers already in one system. Mm-hmm. That like it's not like we're not believers or something. We're completely and totally in the sway of all of the belief systems already existing. That money has value. Nobody questions. Mm-hmm. Like it's a fact. So there's when you're talking about belief, I think that there's a desire to push, or magic or whatever. There's a desire to push that away and to say that that's irrational, as though we're not already participating in a highly irrational belief system.
In such a like abstract, irrational.
There are many irrational belief systems. When you believe in the one you believe in, you think it's the rational one.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is just like it's a fundamental sort of idea of magic that like attracts like, and that's what our whole system is based on. It's based on this sort of like imbuing things with a certain sense of power through. But to what ends and to what means? So, like, where is this train going? So, I don't know. I'm trying to frame it in this way because I want to avoid this sort of like conversation about primitivism that I was conscious of when putting this work together. Like, I didn't want it to be Rites of Spring, I didn't want it to be I didn't want to imbue it with any of that. I wanted it to. And that's why I think it's great. It went in this other way. Like, it went to this sci-fi place, which was great for me. It went to this, like, cyberpunk place. Mm-hmm. Definitely went to punk rock in a lot of ways, beyond just, like, 3 power chords and some tropes. Like, it went to that sort of energy for me.
Well, no, definitely. It didn't leave the world of technology behind at all.
Right.
I mean, and you guys started off speaking in terms of how you wired the space, right? Everything was... It was a highly technological experience. Like, it was digital in so many ways. It's about feedback and...
What are the sounds like in here? Was it really loud?
They ranged...
It was like controlled feedback. If you let something feedback into itself exponentially, it will lose control. So we wanted to push that insanity, but also have a way to control it so that it wouldn't get too insane, Sound is so abstract, it's hard to talk about, but...
it was like fuzzy and syncopated, right? There were like beat activity going on.
Well, Ben could control like when he was recording certain things, and he could control the level that was coming in, so like how loud you want something to record, and then everything that was being recorded was playing back. It was feeding back, so you would hear a repeat that would repeat infinitely. But instead of it just being feedback, if you feedback something enough, then like frequencies add. So it like a higher frequency would become higher and higher and higher. But if you add the difference to that frequency to level it from the first time that it's fed back, then you have like more control over a sound. Yeah, it's like canceling out the original frequency so that you can maintain a level that doesn't get too crazy.
And that was kind of a mistake that happened with Ben and I working. Like, sure, if Cassie had been there, she probably would have just suggested it. But it was just a pitch shifter accidentally sort of got turned on, and the pitch shifter is constantly like shifting the frequency. So it was. And then from there, originally, I don't know how familiar people are with certain like database program things. I'm not too, but I know some things. And Ben started working in pure data with it, which is this way of like actually connecting different sorts of like plugins to filter the sound. And things got a little out of hand. We thought we could get some more, so I suggested using Renoise, which is like a program that people make electronic music on. So then we were able to lay down certain things like as they were tracks in a sort of like electronic song or arrangement. And then there were some samples as well. So for me, we worked with the samples. Cassie had suggested some natural sounds. So there was rain. We just pulled things off of YouTube, actually, and just, so there was some rain. There was some...
A lot of earth sounds, like a lot of nature sounds. and a lot of what this performance means to us is this idea of belief and a religion that is very rooted in nature. And so we chose a lot of nature sounds to kind of reflect that. And some of the sounds that I was using, like I was playing a hacked CD player that was being gated by a sequencer, and all the sounds that were coming out were like ocean thunder sounds. And
yeah, we sort of like, for me, like I remember looking up and hearing the rain coming through. For me, it had this kind of like compression of space, sort of like you actually, for me at least, the rain sort of became this familiar sound that it almost created that moment of reality, like we were on space and maybe it actually started raining for a minute, because it was this very natural sound that was suddenly coming up into the space very subtly. There were some other things too, like I talked to Ben about these beats that you're asking about. Like I sort of wanted him to give me, because there's a whole other, for me, like a performative element of it that relates to sort of the flyer image and the name of the show, this sort of desire to experience and sort of try to evoke the power of a black transsexual. And for me, like, they've been such powerful beings that only exist in this sort of like safe, relative, beautiful, shiny moment. And then when the music's over, there's sort of these lonely, poor beings. And I've really sort of enjoyed, well, at least where I'm from, I mean, like growing up in Detroit and kind of going to house music events in old abandoned spaces, there was always sort of this presence, this kind of sparkling, magical presence of these black transsexual men that lived in very rough areas of the city, and they're magnificent and stunning and inspiring to me when I was like 17 years old. I never necessarily wanted to dress in drag. It was never something I wanted to do, but I definitely wanted to sort of worship at that moment by the relativity of the situation that was going on through house music, which is a total sort of black, gay, poetic expression, right? It's nuts. Disco's nuts. House music's nuts. It's a crazy space to perform it, because that's what it's about. It's about performing. You dance to that music. It's about this sort of like performance of camp and of sort of like sexuality and allure, and it all gets kind of confused too, the sort of gender presence. You have like men that are dressed as women singing songs about a woman, do you know what I mean? While dressed up as a woman. So that they're trying to call this power. They want to be sort of a superhuman in a way, a superwoman, this like exaggerated form of a woman. And that's powerful. It's a really powerful role to take on, and it has its consequences. Definitely has its consequences there. So for me, there were some house music samples. The use of the high heel shoes on the mask is this sort of...
Will you wave that around?
Yeah, this is this mask that I made out of all sort of pieced together women's high heel shoes.
And then, just for those who weren't here, please.
Oh, and then these were sort of on the wall and left for me to stand in and try to walk in. These high heels that had no... So I had to sort of either drag them on the floor. So yes, in a way, this is part drag performance.
I think I just leaned on this thing for a moment and heated it up.
Molly's cooking.
I was just cooking something. I was going, yeah.
So
cooking up.
that was an important part about it. It's like there's definitely a space in there, house music. So I pulled on some old tracks that were around in the late 80s that are pretty interesting to me. And I thought there was some also relative to, well, I'm not sure about that. But yeah, so that was one element in there for me too.
Well, there's can I just interject for a minute?
Yeah, go for it.
I was hoping you would talk about Detroit, because I definitely think that's hugely important. I invited Caleb to do this show because he's my roommate when I first moved to Chicago. He was sort of my guide to Chicago, completely my guide to Chicago when I first got here. He was an undergrad at the Art Institute, and I became a postbac. And he taught me so many things. I mean, he made it okay. He sort of soothed the edges of the terror, which is graduate school and moving to a big city from a small town, and all of the sort of horror of it. And then we sort of went back and forth and taught each other things. And one of the big sort of forces always was magic and romance, or being too romantic. There was a point where we took Chris Catrone's classes together, and we were studying modernity and Adorno and Benjamin, and there was conversations daily where Caleb would start his fantastic rambles, and he would build some castles in the sky, and I would be like, go, with my Benjamin, or my sort of that school or whatever. But it was very, and then he would sort of build them back up, and I would sometimes build them. It's not like I wasn't building them with you. I think we were both really trying to cudgel ourselves and also keep something alive.
You'd be talking to me about that, like holding a tea mug with a dragon painted on it. So I'd always be like, whatever.
Right. No, we can't think this way, Caleb. We have to destroy capitalism with its own tools, or whatever I was trying to babble about.
And it's so funny because later on, I went on to do a year of study of post-colonialism, which has this sort of much more hopeful hopeful outlook as a para-conversation to sort of post-modernism and sort of late capitalist critique from the Frankfurt School. But
yeah,
definitely, I mean, more it's so funny because it's really, because Benjamin guys,
I know, right? I'm sorry. Well, the other thing I want to, so there's this whole sort of, and knowing that, and then Caleb's been making paintings for all those years and other things, but that you would come out of this sort of Detroit house music, queer, drug scene, dance scene, and then also out of sort of, I think, a heavy duty feeling for paganism and for going out to the woods and performing rituals when you were young. And then there's this sort of 10 years of you drawing in your notebooks and drawing these little boys wearing masks doing performances, and the wild boys with burros and all of this sort of thing. So this, for me, I think trying to understand what happened in this room is all sort of understood through Caleb's been building whatever happened in this room for a really long time, and trying to understand what happens when it actually happens in a space, it's real, versus the way you can build a castle in the clouds because you're such a talker and you're such a dancer, and so you've been sort of performing this world for me for a really long time, and for many other people. And then you've been dating men for a number of years who were, I don't know how you would say it, but Santeria worshippers or something. So there's just all these different ways you've been doing this research of living these things out and thinking them through in different ways. And so for me, there's all of that in knowing you. And then there's Julius Caesar, this thing that's been going on now for 3+ years. And we've had almost 50 shows maybe now. And it's almost always been a white cube. It's been painted black 2 other times, but it's almost always been this white cube with sort of
stable objects.
Stable objects, yeah. I mean, this is the first time there's been a performance in the space. There's been video, there's been sculpture. I feel like this is the first time there's been a performance. Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is the first time that the space has been activated in that way at all. And having those 2 things come together for me is so sort of fascinating. Knowing you for so long and knowing this world that you've been building, and then having that world enter this world that I've been helping build and trying to maintain, and having them happen in the same space is super confusing and strange and exciting to me. These 2 things, and my sort of understanding of what I'm trying to do as a teacher, and trying to understand and coach people and building objects to put in white spaces, and then having you do this thing where you turn the space into a black space and try to subvert all of its language into its opposite. I just feel like there's a really
Well, yeah, I mean,
something there.
that's, I think Caleb's pointing out the dragon coffee cup is really the key to what you're saying. It's like you're building this sort of like vaguely radicalized, vaguely oppositional artist-run project space holding your dragon coffee cup. Caleb is building this sort of like spiritual pandemic, viral, incendiary, totally hopeful belief system holding a clean white coffee cup that might be a cube. You know, so you're looking at each other like this, but like there is a sort of transactional, there's a possibility for exchanging these things because the codes, I mean, I think that the clarity and the sort of poetry with which Caleb can talk about this stuff, theoretically, conceptually, intellectually, and emotionally, has to do with training in the vocabularies of art making, and the sort of vocabularies and necessities and maybe ethical and, I guess, expressive requirements of contemporary art. So this isn't just like this burst of joy and sadness in this thing that can barely hold it. It's just like there's a deep level of articulacy, I think, in the language of artists that's sort of required to stage something like this.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, that's what I mean. Like, the very first things you ever said to me were like, I'm interested in how your line, when you make a drawing, Molly, like, you know, sort of wanders off the thing that you're drawing sometimes. I mean, the sensitivity and clarity with which you see, you know, I've had Caleb come to my classes and help with critiques. Like, he's a very, very careful seer. And watching that, like, become something that can be a different kind of sensitivity, I think. Like, there was a kind of chaos in the space in terms of materiality that was counterpointed by the kind of the sensitivity having become like hearing the energy of the space or something. You know, like there was some kind of turning it inside out in this way.
When you say hearing the energy of the space, outside of the sound piece or along with it, or completely like imbued in the actual sound, is that what we're talking about?
Literally in the sound, but I think in terms of the responsiveness, that what was really astounding to me was how sort of highly tuned you were in general, in your body, in the space, in responding to the activity of the space, and responding to the objects. That there was a high level of intensity that was maintained for 2 hours straight. That was captivating. That was like energy captured in the body and like moved through the space in this kind of exploration.
And sort of in my exploration of these interconnected sorts of pulses, energies that sort of exist as a conversation, like this sort of use of my body to explore a heightened sense of reality through, exercise, through pushing my body to certain limits, to running, to I have these sort of like overwhelming sensations while running like 9 miles of there being this sort of like energy, this like inner something that can like hold you. And like, I don't know, so I felt like if I was allowed to experience that I should probably pay homage to it. So I think that was something that definitely moved me forward. And I was really specific about certain things. I wanted things to have what I would sort of allow in. So not only for costs, but I think for the sort of power imbued in objects from the thrift store. The thrift store sort of became our palette in a way. Because I do think, and it's something that Cassie and I talked about, has something to do with Dana's eye for sure, and taking pictures for sure. But there are these moments to me that I was very happy about, that there's still so much painting going on in this space.
It felt like a painting in motion. It felt like living in a painting. And even looking at the images, I can see your paintings in them, you know? And it just seems, it seems so appropriate to like take it to this level, because you are an object-oriented person and your paintings have become more off the page, like things are jumping out in a way that like you have to push it into this dimension. You know, it's like no longer just 2-dimensional. It can live in both. So.
And it's funny, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who curated a show recently down in Bridgeport that Ben, the sound, had a few pieces in, and it was supposed to be about video games as like sort of one of the umbrella things that made it okay to play Dungeons and Dragons in public. So they had this sort of like Dungeons and Dragons tables convention sort of setup, and then they also had all this work that sort of teetered and found sort of comfort in hiding behind things like Dungeons and Dragons, and not just like directly, these guys just not directly admitting like what they really fucking wanted. Oh, sorry, really wanted with
D&D?
D&D, you know, such they didn't even realize how sexual the space was and how frustrated it was, right? But they were just everyone was very much like. So there was a bunch of Carl Barada paintings. There was actually 3, but there were two other artists there that I couldn't differentiate. Like I couldn't differentiate, and it's so funny to me to look at those directly out of coming out of an experience like this, because there was an impetus, there was a desire for me to make these paintings at one point.
Totally.
That I wanted to just start somewhere on the canvas and sort of trail off in this sort of like idiosyncratic decorative like mark making of a landscape, and for what? Like, and my friend asked me about this show, like if I liked the show, and he could tell that I was just like fidgeting, because there was way too many, I'm being such a jerk, but there were way too many things in the show, 1. And 2, nothing showed me that the artist felt any sort of transformation or belief or a particle of like what they were doing was anything but mere just sort of like, you know, like, da-da, it's art, da-da, you know, and they didn't transform any materials. There was 2 things. Someone made a giant owl pellet. That was pretty cool. And someone else like took like an old busted boat sculpture from a thrift store and totally destroyed the whole thing. Like collapsed it onto this board with just like polyurethane binding it all together, and then put it on the wall. And those are the only things where like, these people felt something in the materials. Like they went somewhere with it. And I guess I bring that up for me is because it's interesting how sort of some of these ideas, how easily they can fold into this wandering, this dreamy wandering that I felt like so much. My 20s was sort of about this like dreamy wandering, but like that's sort of a turning away. People, what are people supposed to do with that at this point? Like, how many images do we have? We have so many images that everywhere. Like, yeah, they're in our hands as well digitally. They're all over the place. How is a painting supposed to like stand up to all the photographs people see, all the advertising people see? It's sort of like visual language. Just our current, you know, media. All media is sort of reflects the kind of cultural beliefs that the time is going through, and our definite worship of the image, but our inability to sort of look at it at all, to see it. I taught kids for 3 years a painting program, like mural painting, and it was so funny that they didn't understand that everything doesn't have a clear edge in reality. They didn't understand that at all. I was just dumbfounded. I was like, oh my gosh. Like, reality is like a glowing little screen where all the colors are like, you know, demarcated, and everything has like this perfect edge, and it's possible to beat a beautiful lady lying with a giant lion holding a perfume bottle. Yeah, right. But there's no thought to any like. I wonder about these kids and their subject making, like their subjectivity in relationship to images. So getting back on this show, I started sort of babbling, and I saw this look in his face, and he was just sort of like, and I realized that we had an equal exchange, because that's what I thought about his show. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's what I thought about his show, and that's what he thought about what I was saying. And that was the best art in the whole goddamn thing.
I'd like to interject something at this point. Listening from what you guys were saying, the whole thing about image and visual, I thought what was interesting, at least in the process, or the way you described it, is that it seems like it all started from sound, or at least that was like a trigger for everything else. And you think about it, well, sound is not a visual sense, right? And then there's also this thing about using blinds when you're performing, so you don't see what you're doing or not really know what you're doing. So there's this correlation between blindness or it's suppressing the visual sense.
The ocular,
And
for
then,
sure.
and
Like
then
we
the
destroy an
remains,
eye.
the remains are like this outpouring of like visual material. So I think that it's kind of, for me, it's interesting that you're asking all these questions and you have all these, all these thoughts about the visual culture we live in. But in order to get to that point, you started without any kind of visual sense, and you blinded yourself, which I think is really important. And also, is that supposed to people who shit sculpture? Was that
It was an eyeball.
Yeah, it hung up there. Yeah.
So like you destroyed it. So I think that there's
That was the Great Western Eye.
well,
Like there's a parallel going on there that I found really, really great, and I didn't expect it to happen. I didn't even think about it happening, but so I come out in this long veil and I can't see anything, and I'm sort of blinded, and it's about living in this like ignorant bliss and feeling like high up until someone deveils you and the world around you is revealed. And so Caleb came, and that was sort of my initiation. And so he was sort of like the teacher, and I was, the student, and he was teaching me. So like once the veil was, deveiled, I was, I didn't know what to do. I was like searching for meaning, getting on the ground.
You immediately became tangled in the serpent.
Yes, and that was the idea, is that like, oh, I was ignorant, now I fall. I'm learning, and now I have to search for meaning through these objects and looking at words and trying to read them and trying to find sense in these words, and then just sort of exploiting that ignorance as the fool. And then we sort of reversed those roles about like halfway through the performance, and you gave me the stick to destroy the eye. And in a way, it was like I was sort of like just destroying. It was very connected to like being deveiled and having this vision, but then like taking the vision back away, and then putting him through his initiation by taking the hair from the center of the eye and then rubbing it all over his body, so that the roles would be switched, and that you would go through a transformation through this
And I
initiation.
also felt that was like a desire to force empathy.
Yeah,
I thought it was like this desire for you to be like, this is...
and you were asking to be taught.
Because whenever I was sort of around your character, I definitely felt very masculine. I felt this sort of like, this sort of energy between man and a woman, and I felt like you destroying the eye was sort of like you blinding and killing me, and then the hair that you put on me was this sort of, you were forcing me to have empathy with you.
Right.
You were forcing me to like experience this sort of, and there was a lot of that going on in this for me.
Mm-hmm.
And Molly and I used to have this conversation. I think one time I was watching a woman walk in high heel shoes, and I said, I wish there was something like that for men. I wish there was something that we did like that we put ourselves through, and for some sort of exaggerated form of beauty, or for like a sort of sublime body.
And then
right?
death was sort of the consequence to asking for that, asking to be taught.
Yeah, asking to be taught from you is like you killed me. I was like,
Right.
Your prana destroyed me. in like Hindu belief, there's this idea that all women contain prana, which is this energy that can destroy the earth, and that they need men to help them harness it. But she proved that wrong, I guess. So the room radiates with prana. Ladies?
There's a theme developing. Last lecture we had here, someone said the word penetrationist.
Oh, it's
Ooh.
And you just said, you're on the front of his word.
That was Charles Mahoney.
I like this. I like
Yeah.
this sound.
Nutritionist, right?
And so, I don't know,
There's so much to talk
There's-
about.
there's so
I
much.
guess one thing I want to sort of talk about is this sort of what happened to the sort of wandering little, is that he sort of embraced this like poetic self that sort of denying for a long time, and it doesn't sort of like always writing poetry, but something about I came to the Art Institute, and in my first 4D class I was totally ashamed. Like, that school wanted to indoctrinate me like, bam! No, none of this sentimental crap. It is 2001. So I was like, oh, okay. Oh, I'm not from LA. pretty awful about it. So it was really fun for me. I read a poem that I wrote for this sort of performance that I read it over and over again, and I sort of became proud of it. I sort of, the whole sort of sound, where you're asking me about where the sound came from, I wanted to be in a band. You know what I mean? Like, I wanted to perform like it was a band, and I wanted to be a poetic songwriter. I mean, it didn't really, like, happen necessarily, but, you know, Molly had told me to read Just Kids.
I was gonna say Patti Smith.
Patti Smith, and like, having listened to Patti Smith, having put my dad's Horses album on, you know, and listening to it in his, like, weird room with, like, maps of the stars. My dad was definitely, he's a generation older than my mother. He was in Vietnam, so, like, but he was just a cool dude. Like, he had a Patti Smith album. You know, he's maybe a little too old for that, but he had a Patti Smith album. And always something in my life, but having then read her biography and going back and listening to the music, it's so charged with so much beautiful belief, and like how Blakeian, like how obsessed she is with Blake. She is wonderful.
I know.
And just really being inspired by her, and being inspired by her sort of like embrace of like the cool swagger, right? Like, you know, Johnny, you know, like, and just like feeling that, you know, running so much listening to Patti Smith and just being like, yeah, Patti. So for me, and just like playing it for people, like as if Patti Smith just came out with a new album. Like, yeah, and there's just one line that repeats over and over from her, because there's maybe some things I might read, but definitely want to recite where she goes. Where she says about the boy, "Oh, pretty boy, can't you show me nothing but surrender?" And that was like, for me, that was just like that, like, oh yeah, I can be a poet. It doesn't have to be about surrender. Like, I can make work. It doesn't have to be about surrender to anything, really. It could be about sort of figuring out how to be active in a space that it feels good and it's powerful and it might help people. It might change things. Who knows? But so I definitely felt sort of kinship with her as a poet.
Can I interject some?
Yeah.
One of the observations, in some ways you turned the space into a studio. We were talking about it as a painting. There were points where it felt like, it felt like studio to me. It just felt like process. Like, bend over, pick something up. What will you do with it? I don't know. But you don't have to know right now because you're in the studio. Like, it had that sense of knowing a space well enough to operate blindly, and I operate blindly in the studio all the time, and I think many people do. There's kind of a dumb in a good way blindness in the studio. You know the objects so well, but don't know them at all. I don't know. And a couple of conversations that I had, you know, during the piece, going outside for a cigarette or something, and then afterwards, were fixating on particular moments, and it bugged me. It bugged me that somebody would find a moment and say that was cool. There was this sort of description of like that you guys would sort of generate a certain level of energy or sort of intensity, and then it would fall apart, and that was like disappointing, as though all art isn't disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
Should be disappointing.
We wanted that.
Right, and I loved that.
Yeah.
Like, I really appreciated that. But this sort of, it was interesting to me that some of the gaze of the spectators was, I don't know, whether there was a kind of dominance over what was going on, in the sense of like, that was a good moment.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if they know, or something. As though, and so I kept thinking about it in terms of excerpting, or in terms of like, what soundbiting, right? Yeah, and it's something I've been thinking about more and more. We were just talking at dinner, Sean and Fatima and Lourdes. We just went out to dinner 2 nights ago, and we were talking about how do you beat the soundbite? Like, how do you? If the soundbite is like, maybe that's like the biggest terror of our time, or something, that like, whatever, there are much bigger terrors, but I'll just make I'll make a soundbite about soundbites. But it, you know, it's so dominant. It's so easy to sort of turn something into something little when it's. I think when you're talking about poetry, you're talking about Patti Smith, you're talking about running. Like, all of these things have to do with sort of trying to magic belief, right? Trying to generate something that could be absorptive, or that could be whole in some way, even for a moment.
And that's why I made the choice to make those kind of Greek sculpture kind of chorus masks that could either be worn, if you had one pasted on one way, it was just this blank white face, which I felt like maybe that would be sort of a cue as like receptive, and the face with the mask on it would be this sort of, yes, that's like the ocular world, that's like I need to find the good thing, I can't just experience the thing, I have to know that there is some sort of kernel that relates to this stream of understanding, of history, of art, of my own experience with visual language. So yeah, I was definitely conscious of that, and that's what that eye was too. Like I wanted it to be like looking over, looming over us. I wanted it to be sort of like this thing looking in on us, and I knew that would be happening.
Yeah. It's great you framed it so well. Like you framed us, you know?
Yeah.
Don't forget you guys are here too, is what you were saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And don't forget to notice how you're looking at us or something. Was the,
Yeah. Because there was definitely something we all felt, this like wave. If there was several waves going on, parallel waves, one wave was our levels of anxiety.
We wanted to be vulnerable to failure, and I think there's a lot of similarities in the video that we decided to play, and we didn't edit it for that reason, that there were moments that things weren't working or things would kind of fall, and we don't want to hide that. We want to show ourselves as an artist in the process and give it all, you know? Like,
yeah, the video that we had playing, it was sort of like, had some of these elements of the graveyard. We wouldn't explore the graveyard, specifically sort of attempting to communicate with an African goddess of the graveyard. And she definitely took over.
she did, and what was interesting was that the little graveyard over there, which is what I was supposed to be ruling or sort of guarding, was the only thing that didn't really get destroyed. And I think that's kind of cool, because you want to fuck with the dead. So.
For sure. And it's become like a sort of, you know, there's pinpoints, kind of like centers of sort of, I don't know, all places have like sort of spiritual places, and I realize that I have demarcated those for myself throughout the city in the 10 years that I've lived here, and I always pay homage to them. Yeah. Because, you know, I don't know, I blush about these things, but I need everyone to know that I really do. I feel them. Another thing, sort of, to talk about poetry, there was this sort of moment for me in the performance where I started saying, da da, da da. And it just sort of became, for me, it talks more about poetry because it just came to me more as like sort of a rhythmic expression. And I wasn't even thinking about the sort of like cultural and artistic, like historical kind of reference that I was making to like what was actually happening in relationship to Dada and Hugo Ball. And like, I think that's sort of that space I kept trying to be in constantly. Molly calls it like careful looking. It's a sort of poetic space for me. And I remember when I was applying for advanced painting at the Art Institute, and Barbara Rossi, I said, I want my work to be poetic. And she's like, well, what do you mean by that? And I didn't know, you know, I didn't really know. I think I understand a little bit more. I think that there's this sort of slippage that happens, and that's what I guess I'm referring to when I say poetry, where suddenly the mind is sort of at this middle zone, where there's not just consciousness and it's not just the unconsciousness. It's not reality and unreality. It's both of those things, and it's if you can find a pathway to like, for more extended periods of time, sort of negotiate that path, then I think that leads one to being more connected to things, and things maybe feel better and okay. And I think that is sort of what spiritual energy is. And so if we look at all religions throughout the world, there's such a sense of that. There's such a sense of poetry about everything. Everything sort of expands in this sort of like mind palette that is sort of our negotiation of beauty and fear and love. And it happens on this sort of pathway that seeks to balance those two things. And I think that for me that's poetry. So I guess when I read a poem, I guess I read it now with a little bit more understanding of sort of what a hopeful practice making poetry is. And it should be a little bit more respected. I think it's actually probably one of the forms of expression that's suffered the most from the way our world is now. And I think that shows if poetry is an expression some of these faculties that exist in us, then it sort of shows if poetry suffered, then there's something about ourselves that's suffering, definitely, too, in relationship to that. So I don't know. For me, I think that was something that became really clear after the performance. Even though I was trying to get to a space of poetry through what I was doing, it was almost like the things that I couldn't control. The fact that immediately I turned and my microphone fell down, and the table started falling, and all these things that I had, like, a salt circle, and I had planned out all these things, and I knew in my head, like, rigidly. I was kind of a bitch to Cassie about it a few times. Like,
Where things had to go.
Yeah, like,
being able to navigate. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another
Well, we
thing.
set ourselves up for destruction.
Yeah.
I mean, and I was aware that would happen, and it wasn't until I felt my foot hit the beads that I would just felt like, all right, here it goes, and then the shoes start falling, and then you knock the thing over, and you just went crazy
happening
from there.
Yeah. So, yeah, there was
You
something.
blindfold yourself in a room with all these objects, and you don't know where you are. It's just gonna happen.
And that was what's so funny too about the idea of belief. Regardless of whatever, belief is just a fart. You know what I mean? It's just we're so we spend so much energy of our life making all these things and thinking about it, and then within
Only
minutes,
to destroy them.
it's just and we believed in all these things, and it became something so much more powerful because it imploded and exploded at the same time for us as participants in it and experiencing it. And it's something that we started to talk about. Collaboration was something that was so important throughout this whole thing with Cassie and I. And I think we sort of taught each other quite a bit and realized
Even through
ourselves.
the tarot readings that we did
Yeah.
together, it was just screaming that.
So, I don't know. But yeah, totally. So, I guess if there's anything, anyone else wants to sort of interject or ask, I know we've been sort of maybe it's getting to a point of babble.
Not at all.
The babble.
So what are you gonna do now?
Yeah, I was going to ask you a similar question, what you were talking about, or you were alluding to, a consequence of, say, disco or house music. What are some of the consequences of this? With this sort of huge but minor transformation of this space? Because transformation is it's a funny thing because you're talking about exploding and imploding, and then thinking about utopia or dystopia. And things always, it seems like things tend to go back to zero after a while. Things tend to somehow neutralize, go back to zero. But the expectation for that zero might change depending on when and where I'm living. I wonder, I think I know what transformation means, but then I think about the consequences of transformations, and then I wonder how much things are changing, or if there are any changes at all, if that's always followed by some sort of neutralizing force or norm.
Well, there was definitely I had it sort of hidden in the project activities, sort of in a ritualistic way, trying to deal with on a personal level and hopefully express that to the audience members and maybe have it radiate out of the space, and dealing with the last 10 years of being an American and being here on the planet right now, and sort of passing out of these images that I've been collecting since there's Katrina images in there. There's things that have become sort of comic to us at this point, are very, very powerful, and how they affect us sort of more on a psychological level, and physically the rest of the world that lies outside of sort of the protective hub of Euro-Western American capitalist culture. So yeah, there's definitely sort of a desire to direct the energies that we raised here to sort of dismantle some of that, and that's a sort of hopeful belief. But that's sort of the seriousness at which, if you ask what comes next, is there a 0 point? No, I think there's just more exploration with sort of how far you can extend these things and how can they affect, like maybe trying to fight against going to 0, because I think that 0 is sort of it's the effect of how we do things. That 0 is like every morning. That 0 is like after every meal. That 0 is like there's this constant sort of arrive at the self, right? But you're constantly resetting it back to 0. If that's transformation, since most of our transformation happens sort of in a weird realm that's navigated completely by sort of like digital avatars or substances, and so on like a social level, like how we grow as people and as individuals. I guess if you're asking what comes next after this performance, I guess for Cassie and I, we're still working together on things, and we have projects that we hope to push some of this stuff even further, because we feel like this is definitely an initiation line, pushing us towards being able to not reset to 0. And that's funny that you say that, because I've been feeling that since the performance. Is sort of like exhausting. Yeah. And now what do I do? So I've been watching weird 70s movies about the occult, and like
I feel sort of this like Doppler effect with my reality, because I was so immersed into making and creating the reality that I wasn't actually in it in some ways. Like when you are immersed in something so much, there is like this kind of displacement of yourself, because you kind of like surrender the body to like be open to channeling this energy, but you miss out on certain things that you see in the world because you're in it. And so I feel like the performance kind of bridged that gap between those realities for me. So I feel like a lot of things are catching up with me that maybe I missed leading up to it. So I've been enjoying just going out in the world.
And definitely both of us have talked, and I feel reluctant sort of, and I'm stumbling over words, because like the things that we've talked about since the performance are kind of nuts. They're sort of both personal, and we sort of giggle about it, but it's sort of nuts. And I'm not sure at this point, if you ask, like, I'm not sure if I want to be that vulnerable about that in a space that's just sort of this conversation. If it were another sort of performative space, or if it was something that we were making. Me personally, I'm making a lot of work, like painting work now. It's not necessarily painting, but sort of the materials of this are finding their way in front of me, and I'm handling them in a different way. Sort of taking it as trying to like really do the thing that I'm trying to do. So it's gonna be winter. So what do people do in winter? You know what I mean? So I'm definitely feeling a sense of like hibernation, but there are some other sort of projects that Cassie is sort of more in charge of, that she wants to start working on, that I guess people will hear about it when they hear about it, and that's part of it. But
I thought about making just a black room and call it the Thunder Room, and all it is thunder. And you walk in and it just thunders, and the more people you get in here, the louder it is. Things like that. That it's more like for an installation, but creating an environment that is impacted by mass, and really simplifying it in a way. So we talked about maybe, because this piece was so loaded, we talked about maybe like dissecting it and really analyzing all parts and creating like a context for those ideas to bring more clarity. So it's almost like this performance could be a timeline for the next 10 years of art making,
Yeah, it could just be this sort of kind of expression of these sort of cries that we're making, and I don't know. We'll see. I feel like since the performance we've both talked about, definitely feeling a stronger sort of connection to the world around us. and maybe that's just psychological and it's being sort of filtered, and that's me still with my enlightenment mind being like, well, it could be a psychological result, and these are the things that color that, and blah blah. But like on a real level, we're gonna levitate.
Yeah, that's what we're getting to.
We're working on levitation. Okay.
We're reading about electricity and magnetism, and we will be floating in the air.
So I don't know if anyone who likes the greater than less than alligator analogy is starting to happen. So does anyone else have other questions or anything that they'd like to ask?
A quick question is like you want to dissect this project. No, I'm not but dissecting its pieces and then also like creating the Thunder Room. I'm just curious as to like how are these things, how private are they and how public they can be? And because it kind of reminds me of like Jimi Hendrix's like Electric Lady band and like him like creating that studio so he can kind of like channel these things to produce music.
Mm-hmm.
And then but the music is something for the public that he could give out, but the experience in the room is him like just his private self or something like that.
I think it's
So I'm just
I don't know, it feels like it's sort of both. Like it
Yeah.
feels like there was a lot of sort of reluctancy on my half to talk about it because it did feel like the performance fluctuated between us sort of performing this very private thing and making it public. It's that sort of line that, I don't know, I'm seeking to balance dualities or whatever, just seeking that middle place. And I think at points it did become very public and then private and all together, like sort of wrapped up in one. It sort of became hard. You felt yourself maybe performing a little too, just like in conversation, right? You feel yourself maybe being a little too public about something private, and there's a certain amount of shame that goes along with that, right? And especially in the art world, like there's certain things in place that if you step outside of, you're sort of you're wrapping heads.
Yeah, I'm realizing I can't just like talk freely about these ideas and expect for someone to like,
reciprocate in any sort of way
Yeah.
that feels satisfying.
Yeah.
Or like that you were recognized.
I think it's great that in relation to that you started the whole thing talking about voice. That like that's in so many ways. Like you were saying sound, but I really feel like it is voice. It's something. Voice is something I've been thinking about for so long, and like seems so. Like we may be very like we look at ourselves now like we look at photographs. Like we're very very self-conscious and very very aware of our physical appearances. But I don't think we can hear ourselves very well. And one of the miracles of teaching to me is listening, hearing students' voices change. Like, and it happens often very quickly. Like after a few weeks and a certain level of self-awareness, they'll go from, high-pitched, whimpery, whiny, simpering, stupid voice, or like, we're loud, I'm yelling all the time, but not hearing themselves.
Yeah.
And there's this beautiful movement when they begin to hear themselves and their voice begins to come from somewhere deeper. And I don't know if they know even when the voice but it seems as though they might, But something about voice that it is something that comes from an interior, like we're sure the voice is in there and then it comes out here, but it's from a private space to a public space. Like,
And sometimes that voice changes depending on who's hearing you. And
yes, of course.
And in friendships and relationships, constantly like how people's expectations or their level of security in a social situation, how they sort of impose a way to control or put down their voice. I feel like I'm in that situation all the time. As someone that's sort of like open and likes to be sort of vulnerable, I feel outside of one-on-one conversations that I get abandoned. Like people are like, "Oh, can't be that way." There's other people around. So definitely that sort of. There's so many moments of anxiety that happened in this performance that we've all talked about. Levels of like, are we being too? And we would feel it, and like I made this thing as I'm not leaving the space, no matter how I feel. I'm not going stage left. At the end, I wasn't sure how to end it, so we had to have a little powwow because our telepathy was like speaking in too many images, so we had to say a few words. But that was really beautiful. Thank you.
So
For
I like what you just said about abandoned. I mean, I think, you know, there's all sorts of different words we can use for all of this, but like I keep translating some of what you're saying into like, you're talking about poetry and I'm thinking about reification or something, you know, like, which and there's many ways we can talk about any of these things, but you say magic and I think like, oh, being held, you know, like, as opposed to being abandoned, like trying to make a container of trust or a container of empathy and intimacy between people where all kinds of selves and transformations can just emerge.
are possible. And that's the thing, is like if one is sort of like living out this, if the raw materials around us are no longer nature, if and you put yourself in a position of shaman, what is readily available to you? And it is your fragmented as all hell subjectivity, but it is a powerful space where multiple selves are sort of implicit, right? But they're sort of encapsulated by capitalism. and it's like if the sort of structure of the Enlightenment that sort of supports capitalism, right, and transforms Christianity and does so many things to our sort of spiritual faculties as human beings, if that's sort of removed, and the sort of like floodgate of like belief and subjectivity is allowed to like freely molest objects in a way that they shouldn't, or the way that they haven't before, then there's a potential there to really change things outside of the realm. And I guess if anything, that's maybe a model of revolution that's not necessarily part of our history yet. And maybe it could be. And so I just really specifically choose to use, I could use words like reify for sure, right? Poetry is definitely part of that. But I choose specific words because I think that, yeah, I know, but I'm just saying, like, you're reminding me, it's like, why am I doing this? I'm not necessarily conscious of why I'm choosing specific words, but I'm choosing to use words like magic, and I'm going to say it more proudly this time, with no finger, just magic. No gesticulation to demean it, to protect me. Yeah. Yeah, so.
I was just listening this morning to, what's his name? The guys that wrote Empire and Multitude. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. And he's talking about love. He like, gave lectures on love. And like, of course he has to make qualifiers at the beginning and say like, I know that, you know, this word.
We have to do it.
Love is actually the word I want to use. People say, why don't I use solidarity? And he's like, no, I would like to use the word love.
Exactly. We need to
use the word magic.
We need to.
It's so awesome.
Thank you.
I don't know. Are you ending?
No, I'm not trying to end it. I just feel like there's an antsiness. Maybe we should just say like it's ended if you want it to be ended, and maybe we'll keep talking if you want.
Sure, because I feel like so say that again. Sorry, say that again.
So it's over if you want it to be over. I'm feeling the anxiety of the standing bodies. If you guys want to go, you're totally welcome to go.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
Sorry, it's the performance, but the talk was
Yeah,
great.
sorry.
Thank you so much for coming out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Well, I got one.
Yeah, I got a lot. We got a lot.
Yeah,
we got a lot to do here.
So we'll continue chatting.
Yeah, so I got.
You have to lunch.
Yeah, I'll see you.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks.
I was just thinking about. We wanted to say this for a while. I was responding to your comment when during the performance you said you went out for a cigarette and you talked to other viewers and they were complaining that the energy was up and down. And then you guys were talking about, when you were bringing up the cycle of like, there's this energy, goes back to zero, and so, I think that when you do time-based art, it's always going to be a problem, but whether it's intentional or not. But I'm also thinking that and it also, because you brought up shamanism at least 3 or 4 times already, there's already practices out in the world that are time-based, and I'm thinking like either 12 hours, 24 hours, like Kathakali in South India, or just the 24-hour cycle of raga music in India, not raga music, where it's an old tradition, but there's ways of structuring your time, so instead of going through a climax and then you fall back, it's more like you reach a plateau, that's the climax, and then, it's kind of climbing a mountain. And so I think as time-based artists, of course I'm saying something very theoretical because in practice it's a lot harder to achieve that, but there's ways of without appropriating of the culture, I think there's ways of building those plateaus so that you can actually carry your audience through 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours without the drop of energy. I don't think it's necessarily about you reach your peak and then you fall down. It's more like you reach your plateau and you keep going up. So in other words, it's not a climax, it's just
A series of planets.
right. And so it's hard to achieve, but I think there's ways of doing that. And maybe that does require maybe it does require a little more control. So in other words, or maybe it's about creating a framing device in terms of your structure as you're working. A frame where anything can happen, but it guarantees it's not a consistency of energy, but it just kind of it just enables you to kind of reach those plateaus. And I'm saying something very theoretical, and it's just the practice that you get there. But I think it's just something to keep in mind.
I think that's something that crosses my mind. It crossed my mind at the end of the performance. It's maybe like, okay, well maybe I do need maybe we need to figure out more structure, maybe.
I think that there's a way to gain trust in an audience that helps you achieve that. And I find that even if there's not an exchange of words between people, there's still an exchange of energy.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And it's I think everything factors into the outcome. The bodies that are in the room and their judgments could impact our performance greatly. So it might just be a matter of time before we could achieve that.
But we're not sure if we do, we're
not even sure that we want to.
We're not sure if that's like sort of that's sort of a description about ends to me, like in a way that's sort of like an outlook or a way to understand how the thing will look as looking from the outside in, to describe it as some sort of shape. And I think for us it becomes really important to allow things that we don't understand to happen. And if that does sort of follow this sort of like valley trajectory shape, then that might, who's to say that if we did this in a totally different sort of like context, if we put different sorts of energy into it, the result wouldn't be something that looks more like this. And so in a way that the focus is definitely much more on the means. And Cassie as an individual and as an artist is someone that's constantly reminding me of that. Because for me, I think the desire to control the ends is sort of, it's a response that comes out of expectation and sort of adhering to an art structure. And for me, I think that the other conversations we've had with that kid about his show that he curated is like, well, what is any of this doing for anyone? Like, how is anyone experiencing these things? And I think it's because a lot of that work was just like, I'm working towards this thing, and it's going to look like this, and this is what I'm doing. I met this kid that recently just started in the post-bac program in the painting department, and he came to my flower shop to get some flowers.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, is it okay? Oh.
And he starts talking to me about his ideas for his paintings, and they're just like, I don't know what I'm talking about. No. He just starts talking to me about what he wants to make paintings about in this way that he like knows. So he's like walking around with this other form of anxiety that's about these expectations that he's putting on himself about what to make, and he's not allowing any room for it to like not fall out of this sort of. I'm not going to talk details about what he was talking about because I don't want to make he's on some form of his journey and understanding of art for sure. But he definitely was trying to see the form of the thing instead of experience it. I do think that what you're describing is not so harshly how I'm responding.
I think I'm thinking more about along the lines of Cassie, where I think it's more about listening to your audience, or not listening, but just kind of be aware of where they are. And the example I have is I've been to several times, so like a 24-hour rugged cycle, so and again, it's an old system, but it's kind of based on the moments of the day. And for example, if you're going to be up for like 24 hours, at some point you're going to get tired. In most cases, you'll pass out. But because the music has a sort of rhythm, harmonics, and all that, it's just going to carry you. So you're kind of like in this half-sleep state, but you're still awake. And I think that the performers, because it is a music that's improvised, but again within the framework, they sense that. And so whatever it's the pitch of the voice that they're singing, whatever, they're going to kind of respond to what they sense, I guess. And so I guess I'm talking more about something like that because you talk about the show that the French rated, and again, it's like if you make art, you have an audience, so you can either decide to do what I call therapeutic art, where it's for yourself, and it's all the better if people can relate to it, or you can make art in the spirit of like you're really aware that you have an audience, which doesn't mean you're a sellout. It's just a matter of like finding this fine line where you basically you lose your energy just to use. And maybe if I had been there that day, I wouldn't have felt that way. I'm just responding to comments.
Yeah,
I also think though that Min was more referring to like you were referring more to afterwards, sort of like the post-orgasmic moment, right?
Yeah.
Do you kiss the person you're with, or do you put your underwear on? Like,
And what I was responding, or what I was describing as far as people, the energy low or whatever, I didn't agree with them.
Okay.
But fundamentally, I didn't agree with them. So I was sort of, I felt like they were sort of using a camera eye. You know, they were like, oh, this part.
Very critical.
And I was like,
Yeah.
I don't think they were actually sensing the energy. I don't. But
I don't know if this is, I mean, maybe partially, or maybe half of the people or whatever, but I feel like part of the provocation of this is this sort of like dangerous, dynamic invitation to a shared experience that not everybody is up to. Which is totally cool. Like some days I'm not up to Matisse Faders. I just can't do it. I'm like, I'm at the point with the plant that I lead. Like I'm just not quite there. I think people making it anecdotal or making it episodic in a way, or because they're accepting part of the invitation. I think it's quite a demand to acquire a swallow of a whole. You know, I know what you mean, right? I feel like it wasn't necessarily true, they just didn't get it. I feel like, and even the kid talking about his paintings, I feel like there's something available in the process or in the act of painting that's obviously terrifying. So like you can get part of it, like the language part, the form part, the theatricality, without the absorption. Possible causality.
And I think it's the terror that I think is most interesting to me or something. It's like that would be the thing that you're working against, or but trying not to work against, right? Like I think you're trying to make another space, which is a working against space, but then not working against within that space because you've already made the space in which to do the thing. But that space is actually a deeply critical space, right?
and it's also
Does that make sense?
activated by in a sort of linear sense of time by an audience. Like once the audience came in, I remember getting into position and having a moment of being like terrified.
Yeah.
Of just being like,
Right.
and then just being like, but you know what, you can't stop. And instantly it was like I had to develop, there were certain ways that suddenly that was the first time, I did it on purpose, that all this was on me, that I put, you know, I didn't realize how much the costume was going to sort of change me and move with my body in a way that was sort of not about showing this precious costume that I made. It was more so about how it dragged behind me, actually, how it burned me with its glue gun, like glue, how it picked up shit in the room, how it like picked up my costume so I couldn't use parts of the thing anymore. And that's where actually the terror started to get massaged a little bit and rubbed away. It was when my expectation was completely destroyed by sort of what the thing wanted to do, the kind of chimera that I became when I put that on, right? And that was amazing to me because the whole time I wanted to evoke this sort of sense of, like I was saying, platonic, right? Like these deep sort of like dark, buried energies, right? Because I want to get rid of this sort of like Western sort of self, sort of like constantly breaking things down into smaller parts, analyzing, being meticulous about things, and being just more like loose and sloppy. But I couldn't evoke that energy until the moment of the performance, and then that sort of naturally sort of happened for me. I mean, I was a nightmare to Cassie. I was a total nightmare.
I was a nightmare myself.
Like just like on a personal level, working together, I had to keep pulling that part of myself back, because if this was going to be a true collaboration, I had to, you know what I mean? Like there were certain things I was really specific about.
But it was interesting how that impacted my performance too, and it was actually like sort of like beautiful for me because I did become very isolated in a world that felt like only I could access, which was the whole point kind of for me anyways, was to like be able to live in two worlds and travel to that world and only leave traces of myself and become almost invisible at times. And it was all relevant to the character or the persona that I was trying to adopt and channel through me. So it all worked out perfect in some weird, twisted way.
And I think it was because you were constantly, instead of like, because my sort of persona was about this sort of very linear progression of revealing.
Mm-hmm.
And we had sort of talked about language in a similar way. This is an example of sort of my sort of Western mind, right? I kept thinking about things in a very linear way, even though I adhered to trying to experience things in a cyclical way, more feminine way. But there was definitely this sort of like, when we discussed in terms of a framework that we would respond and bounce off of, I talked so long about the way that we would start employing our voices, that they would start off in these very sort of just like breath things that kind of came out of some collaboration that Cassie and I did together. That got her dog really excited. But and then we would progress towards language, but then at the last minute, that was the way I sort of solved my anxiety about planning and time and everything, was being like, no, I think it should be more singular. So like, we'll sort of set out to be this like 3-part sort of opera or whatever, but actually no, like throw in language every once in a while. Try out a word, like before its time has come. Like let's try to pull something that's ahead of us and bring it to now and see how we can utilize it. I think with Cassie's character, I thought it was interesting how it wasn't about that. Hers was about how many different ways you could bury yourself.
Mm-hmm.
All 3 of her costumes were just, she would go away for long periods of time because it would take her so long. She had all these things, all these elements, right?
And I would have to like try to detach things that I was carrying around, you know. I was all about constraining myself, and you were doing the opposite, but you ended up becoming constrained anyway.
Constrained until I finally like removed the outfit, and then
right.
I was in my costume, and I was just in that like little thong, and to me it was so like. At that moment, right? But then Cassie comes out like as this like strange African reptile, like Anglo beast. I don't even know what she was. Like she was like black armed reptile, like latex. That she created the texture from the fluorescent like cover things that happen. And she sort of came out as this maiden, this muse, this destroyer with her like garland of flowers around her head. It sort of, and there were so many times in the whole thing that sort of it reminded me of paintings that I had seen and like loved, and like the Fates. And so for me it was interesting. There was sort of a structure. We did have a structure, but we sort of kept opening up those little points, like little boxes, and being like, oh, what's really in that? Like, why are we trying? For me, especially, I was like, why am I actually trying to pose this thing on there? Because I definitely think there was something in me that wanted to control this a lot more than it wanted to be controlled, and I eventually just had to let it go.
Mm-hmm.
But I do understand what you're saying. That was my sort of, at the end, maybe it came from a place of shame that I felt like I wanted to control it more. I wanted to go back and sort of understand what it is that we did. There was one point when I said to one of the people in the performance, to Lindsay, I said, I think that amongst the mistakes, because after sort of the energy of the performance left me, I did all that I was sort of warding off with the energy from the audience started to flush into me. There was no, it was energy that was experienced in the room, and I allowed myself to be very vulnerable and sensitive to other people's energies through the performance, but sort of like masking it with this persona. As soon as that persona sort of left, and I was still sort of in a headspin, I felt all of that sort of what Molly's saying about some of the audience members picking out moments.
But also, we live in the argument so visually trained that we're used to snapshots. I'm thinking also just popular music. You have longer songs in 5 minutes. You don't have a popular song that's like an hour long because it's just it's completely different from doing a snapshot, which is what we're used to in this culture.
No, exactly. I mean, I think that's exactly it. It's like there's a certain way people are sort of used to seeing and experiencing, which is all fragmentation, etc. And I think like that's fundamentally, like there's a deep empathy and even like similarity in the way that people were seeing it, and I think in the way that you're in this performance trying to break ways of being. You know, like you utterly understand this desire to soundbite, to fragment, to photograph. Like it was kind of like an incantation for undoing that. I mean, I was thinking about it in psychological terms too, like in terms of, you've said a couple of times that you were a little bitch to Cassie, you know, or that you were really dominating, or that, you know, whatever. And there were moments in the performance when you were a bitch to Lindsay too, like you were, you know, you were sort of reenacting a kind of like,
Psychic drama.
a psychic drama, yeah, and I'm super interested in that in all ways as well, like the way that happens so differently in performance than it does in real life.
And how part of Lindsay's sort of like, this is something that she would probably say if she was here, that her own work so functions on this need and desire to be loved. And like the first tarot card reading that I did for her was just like, nope,
Mm-hmm.
you're not gonna get it.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna be you're an artist that's married to their work, and like her work was like, she's a very interesting artist. She looked at her work on her own work, but it is so much about being in love with this one man. Do you know what I mean? And she's sort of at the end, that last picture, that last sort of image of her grasping her leg, definitely felt this sort of like projection of this performative stuff that she goes to, that fuels is sort of the fire, the thing that like makes her art practice a space for her, and I definitely felt it coming onto me. But that's something that I felt my whole life from certain women that I connect with. So that was definitely like I mean, it is, in the way this is a therapeutic environment, like, it definitely, probably am an artist because I was seeking an initiation, right? You know, so, just we made one,
Yeah,
but,
like shadows on the wall, you know, like these things that are always present, these energies and us, these sort of dynamics or whatever, and then like, you know, setting up this space where like they'll be 10 times as large and cast on the wall as a giant shadow. And it's like, look! And everybody, you know, those people can be like, oh! Yeah, and then somehow and maybe that's like the 0 point too, is like going back to a kind of lack of self-consciousness or something, right? Where like these terrible dynamics that we engage in all the time go back to just being self-conscious and happening, and go back to the terrible, weird, simpering voices that are, you know.
and trying not to do that. That's, I guess, what he's trying to respond to, is like trying not to go back to zero, trying not to have a simply whiny voice, you know, after the energy was sort of expelled. But there is that sense. But that happens in everything. Like it's just reflected in all of the ways that we relate to things. I wonder, for me, that there's this other sort of thought and idea that Cassie and I bounce around and talk about, this encounter with beings that are, or other humans that are more empathic just by nature. And sort of like, what do you do with that now? Like if we're seeking some sort of initiation, right, or we're seeking out to be artists, it's because possibly we are empathic, and what would we have been in a different time? What would people like us be in the future? And I guess I try to include most artists in that, because I definitely really think that that's what the desire to make things is to create a sort of channel for that energy that can latch onto the feeling and temperature of the room, as well as finding that in the landscape, or finding that in the words of an author, and how reading a book is so alive to someone that is tuned into things in a certain way. It's not so much just reading, but experiencing. It's craving those experiences and craving a sense of like home or sanctuary, if one feels that way. So I guess that's probably the desire to make paintings, even though I'm a pretty performative person.
Yeah, I really, I mean, it kind of opened things up for me when you brought up painting. In terms of this installation or setup, or, you know, I mean, it's really it's really productive for me to think of this as like a hopeful site for painting. Because I think as you were talking about your terror prior to your performance, that's exciting. And probably just as yours was exciting, mine was starting to increase actually, because I was noticing all these like cultural cues. Like I'm like, okay, so there's like loops and feedbacks involved. Like I can hear like minimalist music of this, and Gaga for sure, like some sort of like like feature images, like all of these, but like I wasn't. But and also like I was thinking of like cities like Berlin. Okay, like maybe you brought up Detroit. I can see that too. But there are all these kind of sort of faraway, discrete platforms that I had to kind of jump around. And it was really, it's not like there was this like comfortable pathway that went all of these. So that's when I realized that I was, okay, so I know time isn't linear, but I don't think about it that way because I look at my watch and know what time it is. Like I know when I'm supposed to eat, when I'm supposed to go home, etc. And all of that kind of, all of those things, those habits, had to disintegrate or I had to a little bit when I entered this performance. So I think that's where the sort of the power I felt, sort of the power of performance I felt came from. It did precisely that when I didn't really quite know how to navigate myself through these like times, these different cues. And I was like suspended for a really, really long time in that. And that's maybe that's where like the magic or even like levitating or that's already there, you know. So maybe it's in that sense like I guess I was levitating.
Cool.
Good.
Cool.
Yeah, so I guess terror is
Yeah, tarot is good. It's like an element of the sublime, right? You know, so-
yeah, and I mean, I felt like a little bit scared, but also like coddled at the same time. That's like a very strange sensation. It's like definitely okay for me to be here, but I was still a little bit scared.
No, I totally,
Yeah.
I'm with that. I guess. Just I think that that's the thing. Like there's a sort of immediate, I think, affective material and sort of cognitive dissonance between these sort of fragmented materials and sort of broken off from their original intention and their desired utility. I guess it's sort of in a sort of terrible jury orchestration at first. But like so you have that, and then we also have like, wait, shoes are for feet. And all the shoes are up, over on his head, or here, and you're like, well, there is like a metaphoric potential. And things aren't just being broken off and sort of left ruined and derelict. They're made mobile and like flexible and reusable in these ways. And I think that was where I think that's kind of where I was able to do this. And just like, okay, things are being reused out of necessity and out of like desire and hope. Does that make sense? It's like, yeah.
Instead of like a verticality, there's a suspended horizontality. Like,
Yeah.
So
And
it's
we
like-
all this sort of jungle thing, right? Where like all this activity is sort of underground. There's kind of nothing in the middle for you guys.
I think for me that rerouting
You're right.
or these featuring different times or objects together or something, for me it would have a lot to do with painting the picture. Like I really felt the like painting making black, like like making just like being into goth music or whatever. Like there were so many sort of signifiers like that were so different from when we were activating them when we were, me and my crowd or whatever, when we were just like 16 and 25 or something. Like how many colored rooms did I hang out in? How many, like how many dark weird things? How many seances did we try to have? But like there's just so much of that, like trying to do something or something, and feeling the difference between what you guys did, which was so sort of adults, and so like it felt sophisticated in all these ways, but then it was routing itself through those memories for me of being young and trying to make something
Seeking
happen.
self-origins and like finding out that they're sort of empowered in a different way, but they were important.
But they were important, right? And that there were all these objects and all these signifiers and all these potential sort of incantatory rituals that I could, if I had understood more or if I had been less stupid, like that I would be, we were on the right track or something. There was something, it was going back and recuperating being a teenager and being like, you're on the right track. Just, don't let that one go either. Like, it's all part of this thing that you're still trying to pull together or something. How to emancipate yourself.
How emancipate yourself, for sure. Emancipatory act and like adolescence is that sort of.
Right, totally. And like going back and recuperating adolescence and saying like, no, I wasn't stupid. Like, I was onto something.
It's so funny that it's like thinking a lot about adolescence being almost the kids that I taught and how there is this sort of there's a code of being an adolescent and it involves sort of like a trajectory of listening to certain music and it follows the same path. And all teenagers at the same time, like in the 90s differently than these kids in 2008, 9, 10, like, and how the same sort of like landmark people are on it. Kurt Cobain, kids still wear Kurt Cobain t-shirts. I think that's hilarious. I love it. Right? And like, is he a figure? Is that last image of his like Converse One Star and like the place where he shot his head off? Is that an emancipatory image for teenagers? Sort of like, is this the sort of like realm that we're living in now? Because they latch onto that. They latch onto this image of a person that had such a short life, and we've always sort of done that. But is that an emancipatory moment? Like that's a weird thing to be a cultural heir to as an adolescent. A man who was like affected with drug addiction, was an amazing sort of like beautiful poet and then killed himself. And these kids take that on in this very sort of ironic, hilarious but beautiful way, and they take on punk music in whatever way they understand it, and they take on these sort of like, yes, this sort of like the history of sort of cultural revolution of the 20th century. They take that on and they go through it themselves in a very commodified, mediated way, but we all sort of do it, and it does feel really important, and it does like really matter, and I think that's something that should be sort of taught. It's like this experience, maybe the signifiers or things in the experience are not necessarily what's important, but it's the feeling that those things generate.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be sort of part of pedagogy, right?
One of this too, coming from house mystery is Egyptian and just like I think the core between showing your story this kind of pedagogical apparatus is investment. Like that's just like being able to invest, how to be able to invest in illusion and all of these things, even though they're not quite true, most of them are fantastical and fictive after a point, but looking for some sort of exemplar, some sort of model. You have to at least partially, you're investing in the icon of this person, but you also kind of invent it a little bit too, which is so much, I think about this performance, and a lot of people, but we all kind of do that in a way. Just like, I love Agnes Martin, I am making up this Agnes Martin a little bit, because I have to.
Yeah.
And that's how you can sort of go through these things and make them be, not sort of using the extant cultural mechanisms to tell you what they mean already.
Yeah.
The kids wear their Kobe shirts and they wear their Tupac shirts and they wear their like, Batman's Joker shirts, and they're all kind of the same. This sort of like capacity to invest in sort of cultural detritus with something allegedly radicalized, and at least to get them out of the moment that they're in.
And like sit on a picnic table and smoke a cigarette when
Yeah.
you're supposed to be in that class.
Yeah.
And just be like, you know what I mean? They've got the like, there's people before them. This time I'm gonna do it right.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh man, that's so good.
We can do it a good job. We'll do it together.
I did it with a 4.0. So I was a good kid too.
Never get in trouble.
I watched, the reason why I'm able to recall that sort of like vignette is I watched it. I watched the kids doing it. I watched the kids smoking their like trails of rebelness out of their mouth, you know. Well, I like had to be home immediately. Yeah, so don't feel bad.
No, I think I watched it. I think that most people, no, I wasn't actually that good. She was awesome.
She was
I wasn't
awesome.
her.
She touched my hand.
She slapped my locker on my fingers at one time.
Feels like I've been sitting at the beach.
I know.
Sand on my
Sand
butt.
salt in my hair.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to end this or not, but I guess the thing I didn't want to, the reason I didn't want to end it before came up is I didn't, you guys know this with reciprocity a couple of times. I don't want you guys to feel like we haven't or can't reciprocate, because like you're offering a lot of vulnerability and information and thought and sort of care in this thing. I didn't want to leave being like, thanks, record it out the door. So, so I think that if you guys have questions about like what we, I don't know, you know, I mean, I think that because you delivered a lot, you delivered things really beautifully. I'm having sitting in this talk kind of the experience of having a performance. It's like, well, I give it a lot, I give it a lot, like, and I think, am I up to it? And like, can I empathize with this? I want to be able to. I want to think I'm the guy who can stand up to this, but I don't know that. You know what I'm saying? Like, so if there's anything, I feel like I would like to reciprocate. So I'm up to it. If you have any questions, that's all. Now I'm really.
Well, I understand because it was in trying to think and prepare for this talk. I definitely had quite a bit of anxiety because in terms of like what the expectations were of it, and then to have it sort of turn into us all sitting on the floor and just having a conversation. Where I do feel like you guys are, reciprocating greatly. Like I feel like I understand for people that were here. I feel like I understand the experience of it. I think it's true. I think that. We sort of all appreciate the sort of language that we're using to talk about an experience. And for me, that's pretty much, it's great to be in a room with people and to have them know that I'm listening and to know that they're listening. And that's like awesome. So I feel like when people are up to it, it feels good, right? Yeah. So that's what I wanted, I think that's what we both wanted outside of all this sort of desires for magical greatness in rock and roll. We just all want to like listen to each other. So I feel like I don't want you to feel like you didn't reciprocate.
I threw a penis at you. Where's the cigar?
It's fantastic.
So it's a bit of intestine, you're right.
Yeah.
No, I just want to make sure.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Do you have any questions? I mean, do you feel? No, that sounds like joking. Come on, girl.
I don't feel like I'm left open-ended. I feel like it's really great to hear you guys speak and reflect. It's really nice to be back in the space and kind of think about it again and try to generate that same energy. And it's exciting to have people invested in it because it was kind of like a tricky territory. I mean, like it does put us in a vulnerable place, and language can only do so much. So, like, this has been great. It's been a great opportunity.
So I feel like the language. It's alright. I feel like the language that people use is really coming from a good place, and to know that something that we worked on and that we produced can create that sort of language and that sort of feeling. It feels good.
Yeah.
And it does feel sort of like generous both ways. So thank you.
Go infect everyone.
Viral.
You guys have done performances, and like you run a space. Your house is a space, right? You performance and other people performance in, and like you guys have done some collaborative performance in other places. Like, was it different here in any way, or was it like?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is what I want performance to be. Like, this is what I want. I feel like I want to see more of this. I want it to feel theatrical and composed in a way that it's not, that it feels like you're entering their space in a way, like their mind. And a lot of spaces are sort of just like set up and ready to go, and their body just gets thrown in there. And like I like to have a sense of their reality visually. I mean, you couldn't just walk in here and feel nothing, even if our bodies weren't present, you know. And I think that's what we wanted. I think we wanted to create a sacred place that you would enter and feel something without needing a voice, even, because the voice is invested in all the objects that carry it. So I'd like to see that more. It's very time consuming and it does take your whole life away, but it is our life. So
Yeah, I think in terms of like things I've seen for performance, I often feel like a performance is usually sort of that I've seen is generally more repetitive of sort of composed intellectual actions that are supposed to sort of like give you an understanding of something, right? And this was more of a sort of theatrical sort of opera that utilized some of those things. There were definitely moments where I was I felt myself pulling from sort of a language of sort of 70s performance that was about like struggle and strength and trying to blow the words. Yeah. But I think that some of that stuff sort of got enveloped in this unfolding experience that we were all going through, sort of the audience was experiencing. This bubble here. It's like, I'm like, but no, I really enjoyed doing it in this space. This space to me has, meaning for it too, outside of the performance, as it is like, my friends run it. I've seen some shows here that I really like. I've participated in some of the things that go on here. So there definitely was a sense in terms of where I performed that it made me feel more comfortable. The fact that something mine and we're both part of this space made me, as a performer, in terms of performance anxiety, performance made me feel like there was a lot of expectation. Like I couldn't just we couldn't just give half-ass. I had to feel a little bit. There's some smart-ass ladies. So, for me, like that, this space has that sort of aura to it, right? Like, there'll be something, things don't. I was at a ginormous, huge warehouse space in Bridgeport where they showed that show about video games I was talking about. It's a beautiful space. It's probably, with the basement, it is, I don't know how many times bigger than Julius season.
The little brother, or what was that?
I don't know. It was a little.
Don't say it.
Yeah, I don't want to bash. But I don't remember anyways. It could be an amazing space, but at the same time, I don't know. I enjoy working here quite a bit. I'm glad that this happened too.
yeah, too.
If it had been in a bigger space.
Right. I liked that you were kind of like constrained with that small space
And I like that the audience that comes here is not necessarily a performance audience, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because we're not necessarily performance artists.
Right.
And yeah, that's your painting audience. I mean, I still think that maybe that's just the apparatus with which I have to understand everything, but I feel like there's so much. Like the people who usually come to Caesar are able to ascertain the information that we're provided because there's improvisation, because we have a system process, because of the look of the thing, not quite being what the thing is about, like all this sort of. This is typically a cue, but it holds a certain set of vocabulary. I think that so much of what the work of this is this sort of improvisational, blind, driven process. I think it worked out really beautifully. I'm not quite sure what contemporary performance is otherwise, because of this code and because it's very much clearly set of gestures and their intended results, which I think it's just a margin through strategy.
No, I was just gonna say, like, in terms of the memory of for me, the space holds the memory of all the shows that happen in that space, and having that memory, and then having this be a conversation, because it has to be with that memory. So, how, just the show that just succeeds it is throughout the Lucy's show, and she had these sort of objects in states of deconstruction and reconstruction, and like this garbage, right? Total garbage, yeah. Like, but put back together, with cement, and Like those things were like.
Figurative gestures here too.
Yeah, but they were isolated in this white wall, and they were sort of like, these, but they were sealed in this way. And then, the white walls that usually have this black is like, it's the opposite, it's just bare, and everything in the show was doing that for me, like, these things are being made and being broken. Whereas usually the space is holding objects that have already been made and broken and then recuperated into a still object, and so in this really great way. And because Julius Caesar just had a massive transformation as well, that 2 members left and 3 new members came on, and so it was a total cleansing. It was a total okay, blow the space out, and for me it felt really super ecstatic and super refreshing. Just okay, out with the new. And you have to destroy everything to get anything. Yeah.
So in a way,
That's exactly, yes, that's success.
I'm so perfect. And we even caused some trouble with the landlord, and we were just we had to go punk rock for them. We had to have our nighttime assault. I'm grateful.
Yeah, and so
we are grateful too for allowing the space to sort of facilitating and documenting for us as well, because that's a bummer if we hadn't had any. But yeah, I'm glad that it I guess I keep going back to what you're saying about what next. It does sort of give me, because and to be honestly so completely vulnerable, it's yes, like Molly says, because she knows me on this level. This is, for me, my part of this performance, and sort of the orchestrating it and the directing of it really did imbue everything with this sort of forming of self in my sketchbooks and collecting of images, and I just let it all out there and imbued it with that power. That stuff was simultaneously making me grow. It was holding me back in a lot of ways on a personal level. And what next? Have I exhausted that energy? Is that a well that I can go back to? I don't know. Did it just sort of come out in this sort of tiny little explosion of confetti, or is that something I can access all the time and it's only going to get stronger for me? Is this a liberating gesture that I made for myself and for the audience, and for in collaboration with my friends who are artists?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's next. It does kind of scare me a little bit, because it's so easy for the mind to start boxing itself back in.
It makes me think about, I have a friend in the press, Tracy, who is she went to school for a long time to be a herbalist. So she's all these tinctures. She's in this huge herb collection, or whatever, tinctures that she's made out of it, and different potions. So it was all about potions for a long time. She was, a natural healer who had potions. And then she moved on to massage, but then it was about oils and having this room to perform massage and healing touch and whatever, but still having the herbs and things. And now she's studying, cranial sacral therapy, which is whatever, super new agey idea, but it's deep healing from within. And the tincture stuff becomes less and less important. And it's watching her on this sort of at this point, it's 15, 12 years of education as a healer, and becoming sort of going through these phases of healing. And tons that she knows all the bones of the body. She knows the digestive system inside and out. She knows it's not like she's not getting Western notions of the sort of scientific structure of the body or whatever. But as she moves along in her learning, she keeps letting go of this stuff. She doesn't need those little bodies.
Yeah.
It's just
as a healer, she doesn't need to connect onto these things.
The objects, the stuff, they're not the point of healing. Healing is something that you bring, she can heal naked at this point. She doesn't need, and I think that that's the kind of journey. I keep thinking about this in terms of healing, healing self-healing, and that kind of. But the objects to me are only important as long as you, the space even is only as important as long as you need them.
It's interesting, I ended up working with those kids for 3 years, the same group of kids. And it sort of became the unofficial sort of gay club, also the mural club, right? In different states of being open about their sexuality. And one day I wasn't able to come there, and we had like this one wall that we had to finish. They all knew that the program was ending because the funding was up. And they, without really asking, painted one of the walls with like wicked pride, like rainbow all over it. Like, and they were like super proud of that, and they showed me like, the next day. I haven't. Some of these kids, some of them dropped out and they still came to the program. Some of them were in military school and they would still come to the program. So I worked really closely with them in terms of healing, like in terms of art making, in terms of they were a crucial part in me breaking down all the things that I had learned, at school. And I was a crucial part in sort of an emotional kind of education for them, and we helped each other in so many ways. And that sort of ended, and then my day was, I now had a free Monday. It's like, what am I going to do? So I contacted the Arts of Life people. There was this studio that facilitates art making and has for 15, 20 years in the city for adults with mental disabilities. And they show their work in cafes all over the city, but I would just be a lowly volunteer studio assistant, which I'm going to start because the kind of working on this project took up my Mondays. But I told her, I was like, as soon as sort of done, and after Thanksgiving, I'm going to start working with you guys. I basically just go on there and help these people like clean their brushes and sort of help them clean up their lunches. And if they have questions about materials, do that. But I'm really excited because I've been looking at this work that they've been making for years now, just the decisions that they make, and just, and it's totally not going to be a me going in there and sort of like gleaning or whatever, sort of like raw brute genius I can from my amazing painting. Even though I think that's why, no. But I hope that it really becomes like sort of an intimate experience, and so yeah, for me it does. I think maybe about moving out to sort of being somewhat of a healer, and if that means like that impetus takes me to a place where I want and helping people, and helping actually instead of just bitching about the way the world is on some level, then that would be amazing to me. And maybe I'll die a toothless homo in Africa. You know what I mean? But damn it, it's better than being in a biennial. Voila.
We have this.
Yeah.